In this video, we're going to be going over direct object pronouns. So let's first start with what exactly a direct object pronoun is. Well, direct object pronoun is a pronoun, aka a word to replace a person or a thing, that demonstrates, so pronoun that demonstrates who/what is being directly affected by the action. Now, this is a little bit different than, let's say, the subject pronoun. The subject pronoun, that's who does the action. So remember, this is very different in the sense that it's who's being affected by the action. Not who's doing the action, but who's being affected. So, for example, if I were to say, you know me. You know me. We have two different people going here, and two different pronouns. We got you and me. So you will be the subject pronoun, which is who's doing the action, and then me will be the direct object pronoun, who's getting affected by it. And so you can see this whenever we look at any set of pronouns in English. So for example, if I were to say he, him, she, her, stuff like that, the first one is always the subject, or who would do the action. The second one is either the direct object pronoun or the indirect object pronoun. There's a difference between those two in Spanish. I'll go over that in a sec. But it's basically either who's being directly affected by it or who the recipient of an action is. So let's look at the direct object pronouns in Spanish and translate them over. So me is going to be me, te is going to be you, lo and la is going to be him or her. Now it's important to note that this can also mean it, but it depends on the gender of what we're talking about. So if you remember, there's no such thing as it in Spanish. It does not exist. Everything's either a him or a her. It's almost like everything in Spanish is personified. As if, let's say, for example, I like to use this example, if somebody really likes their car and they say, oh, she runs very well. You can see we're referring to it as a she, right? And so everything in Spanish is referred to it like that. There's no such thing as it. So everything's either going to be a lo or a la, depending on whether it's being referred to as a him or a her, or whether it is masculine or feminine. Next, we got nos, which is going to be us, and finally, los and las, which is going to be them. Them can refer to objects, or it can refer to people. And so this is how we translate each of them. And remember that these are always going to demonstrate who or what is being directly affected by the action. So let's also take a look at what the difference between direct object and indirect object pronouns is. You may have learned the me, te, le, nosos, les, especially if you learned that from like the word gustar, one of the most common verbs that uses those. And so in English, there's no difference, but in Spanish, there is. So basically, those mean to or for someone. So for example, if I were to say, I give it to you, you can see we got three different things going on here. We got I, we got it, and we got you. Three different pronouns. And so I is going to be the subject, that's who's doing it. It is going to be the direct object pronoun because the giving is directly affecting it. And then finally, the recipient of the action will be the indirect. So overall, that's the main difference between it. If it's to or for someone, it's indirect. If it's directly affecting, then it's going to be the direct object pronoun. So let's take a look at how they work in Spanish. Now, the first thing to note is the placement of them. So if we take a look at the placement, what it's going to look like is they go before, so it'll always go before two different things, go before conjugated verbs and negative commands, and then after infinitives, or also known as unconjugated verbs, or also like attached at the end, essentially. So attached at the end of infinitives, affirmative commands, and finally gerunds, which is essentially ing in Spanish, or ando and yendo. So overall, you can see that there's quite a lot of things to memorize for placement, but the main two we're going to focus on in this video are going to be conjugated verbs and infinitives. Every single sentence has a conjugated verb. So a lot of times, you'll see these come up, and then a lot of sentences also tend to have infinitives, and so you can put that at the end. So I'll give examples of each of those in a sec. So let's take a look at how direct object pronouns work in general. We'll just take this sentence up here. You know me. You know me. So what I like to start with is I always like to start with the verb. And here's why. Is because we want to think about who's doing the action of the verb so we can conjugate it right, and then come back in and put our direct object pronoun in. So first we'll start with the verb. Conocer is to know or to be familiar with. It can also be saber, but in this case, if you know people or places, it's basically showing that you're familiar with them, so it's going to be conocer instead of saber. So we got conocer. Now what we want to think about is who is doing the action. Who is doing the action? Well, it's you, right? And remember that it's always going to be conjugated to who's doing the action. So I cannot say conozco. Conozco would be I know, but it's, even though we have a me right here, it's you that's doing the action. So conozco does not make sense here. It'd have to be conoces. Conocer, go into the to form, conoces. Then what we're going to do is we're going to see who's receiving it. So conoces, you know. Me, I am the direct object pronoun. So me is going to go to me. And finally, we'll look at the placement. It goes before conjugated verbs. In this case, this is a conjugated verb because we've changed it to reflect who's doing the action and what tense it's in. And so it's going to go before. So it's going to be me conoces. You know me. Now, the interesting thing about direct object pronouns, and something to watch out for, is a lot of times you actually have to read them almost backwards. So we'd have to say you know and then me. But it's one thing to note is the fact that the literal translation is to me, me, you know. And so it still makes sense, right? It's just a little bit different of a word order. And one thing to note is that in languages, the word order typically doesn't really matter as long as the same idea is being put across. So let me give you an example. Let's say if I was making my own language, I could throw the words in whatever order, as long as the idea that I'm communicating makes sense. And so in Spanish, they put the direct object pronouns before, which doesn't make sense to us in English, but in Spanish, that's what makes sense. And vice versa. It doesn't make sense to put it conoces me. That sounds completely wrong. You'd have to say me conoces. So let's keep going. Let's say I have it, and it's very important when we're looking at it to see what it is referencing. We'll say the table, or in Spanish, la mesa. And I'll show you why it's important in a second. So first, let's start with I have. How do you say I have in Spanish? We got the word tener, to have. The yo form, it's irregular, tengo. And then what is it referencing here? It's referencing la mesa. La mesa is something that is feminine. So remember, there's two ways to say it in Spanish. It's either lo or la, in this case with direct object pronouns. And remember that it doesn't actually really exist. It's got to be either a him or a her. So if we're referring to something that is feminine, we'd have to use the feminine one, which will be la. Finally, where's it going to go? Well, it goes before the conjugated verb, so la tengo. I have it. Now, let's take a look at one more example concerning infinitives, in which we basically look at a sentence and show how to do it in two ways. One in which we're placing it before the conjugated verb, and one in which we're placing it at the end with infinitives. So we'll say this, I can do it. And it is in reference to, we'll say, doing homework. That's not a good one. We'll say, we'll say the homework. The homework. Okay. So in Spanish, homework is la tarea. So first what we're going to have to do is figure out how to say I can do, or I am able to do. Or to say to be able to in Spanish, use the word poder. The yo form, it's irregular, it goes to puedo. It's a stem changer. It should be puedo, but it's actually puedo. Next we have hacer, to do. And then finally it is in reference to the homework, la tarea. Now one thing to note, once again, no such thing as it in Spanish, so we have to decide whether it's a him or a her. If it's in reference to the homework, it's something that it's feminine. It ends in an A, right? It's also using the feminine form of the. So it's going to be la. And we're going to put it either at the end of the infinitive attached to it. So puedo hacerla. Or we can put it at the beginning of the conjugated verb. So you can see it's going before. Here's our conjugated verb, the verb that we've changed to show who's doing, to show who's able to, and when it's happening in the present, right? And then we have our infinitive to do. It's not I'm able, I do, it's I'm able to do, so we'll be using an infinitive. I'll say it right here. So you can see right here we've attached to the end versus here we've put it at the beginning. So overall, direct object pronouns in Spanish, they can be a little tricky because you have to be thinking about multiple things at once, right? You have to be thinking about, okay, who's conjugating the verb, who's doing the action, and then you also have to think about what's receiving it. And what's receiving it will always correspond to these right here, the me, te, lo, la, nos, and los, las. If you're in Spain, also os. And so with direct object pronouns, it can be difficult, but if you just slow down, if you think about exactly what's going on, if you know the placement rules, you should be fine. Now, one thing is I'm also going to be doing a guided practice through these in the next video. So if you're still a little confused, please be sure to tune into that, and we'll work a little bit more on these. But thanks for watching. See you guys in the next one.